Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 11. Upon the throne of King Amadokus, whose body was never found, sat Prince Pairisades of the Bosporan Empire. His head was wreathed in flowers in a southern style, and his sword was placed across his bare feet, in a style he is credited with inventing. The meaning of this was that he should be dismembered if he tried to escape his duty. It was the third day of his rule over Apollon, and many of the leading families had come up from the city to bow before their new governor, whose kingliness could not be missed, if only because the city folk were used to kings and would not consider bowing to anyone lesser. By then, those who had no stomach for the political lurch the horsemen had delivered were walking out to find solace elsewhere, mainly to the Getae fiefs in the south. Thus the city was calm, secure behind its earthen walls and halo of round tents, and while there was disturbance caused by the mythoses pasturing their horses on cultivated land, these dramas are common and usually fall away to one side of a sword or the other. Pairisades had assembled the court to give public audience to a hero whom we have already been amazed by, Amadokus, one of the 3 old dogs who served below the late king. He came to the citadel at Apollon willingly, and was dressed in a Pergamese fashion, augmented with a sash of eastern silks. He was followed by 6 Ephebi carrying heavy baskets, all showing off tattoos that depicted feats of the Dacian gods. These baskets were placed before the prince as if they were a gift, when in truth, their contents had been looted by the captains of Gwena Greek-speaker from the citadel's royal cellar. Each basket was filled with thin slices of stone, on which epics of never-before-seen length and detail were etched. This treasure was worth more than anything anyone there had ever seen, although this was not something most could know. Pairisades, well instructed in the field, knew that these 6 baskets were akin to boxes of Pandora, and perhaps he hesitated to go down the path the gods had put before him. Let he be praised for crushing such thoughts, if they arose at all. Amadokus had the honour of turning these treasures over to the Spartacid dynasty, and of being the representative of the vanquished Getae in the court. He approached the prince and rose his hands, which stirred the room, since his magical abilities were well known. Nothing ill was afoot, and instead everyone saw that his hands were bleeding from open wounds. Seeing this, the prince bent down and drew his left hand across the tip of his sword, and the foreign dignitaries seemed to enjoy this pageantry as much as the local nobility. Pairisades and Amadokus now addressed each other across their mess of spilled blood, Amadokus calling Pairisades the king of cosmos lovers, and Pairisades calling him the trusted scion of gold. Pairisades asked for elaboration on the former title, and Amadokus said, "You will see what must be done. You will see what must not be done. Then you will see what you have already done, and cut your hand clean off." While this was relayed through an interpreter, Pairisades and Amadokus never looked away from each other, and the festive mood that had carried the court through the previous day faded and was forgotten like a sweet dream. Pairisades requested that Amadokus state his terms for the surrender of the Getae kingdom. He didn't have leave to make such a surrender, since the Getae had a legitimate heir campaigning across the Istros River at the time. Amadokus said that no surrender was called for, since their conflict was of vital importance. Pairisades pleaded mercy for the people of the unspoiled lands, whose peace was at dire risk were supplication not achieved. Amadokus did not respond to this. Pairisades then made the offer he had doubtless been planning on delivering. He said that if Amadokus was willing to give his life, then all Getae people would be made citizens of Apollon, all slaves would be returned and freed, and he would step away from the throne in favour of any ruler the leading men of the city wished to appoint. Some will say that to offer your interlocutor death was not proper form, and others will say that Pairisades should have executed Amadokus and offered no reward to any but the first man who volunteered to carry out the deed. But see this exchange for what it was, a ruse to impress those among the nobles who knew what a king of the Golden Age should do. To prove this, we need only continue the scene. Amadokus said that he would not die because he had been visited in a dream by a god from the cosmos called the Brilliant Early-Born Child, and told that he must fight those who wish to destroy Manos's creation. The Brilliant Early-Born Child is what the Getae called Helios, which in turn is what the Greeks had derived, mistakenly or not, from Husos. This was a paragon deity ascended from a girl who lived in the Golden Age, attested to in many Lithosis legends. She is said to have been the one who kept the days and nights the same length in those times, who is invoked when one wishes to restore order in one's life with the next rising of the sun. Since she was a paragon, not a god in the strict sense, Amadokus was wrong to say that she was from the cosmos, but details like that I must leave to explain later. Indeed, I shall leave this matter aside, because that is also precisely what Pairisades did. He ignored the story, and replied, "Who is this chief who will not sacrifice himself for his people?" And it is here we can be sure that Pairisades had taken upon himself a similar mantle, the bridle of old knowledge, and willingly gripped his bit between his teeth. He wished to shame Amadokus, as did those who feared him, and I believe this act was a success. However, Amadokus was not without tact or ability to scheme, and he too wrought success when he offered to bring the people of the Getae to the prince's side in exchange for being spared punishment. It was as if he invited further humiliation on himself, for he wished to wear such scorn as a cloak. An agreement was made, and Amadokus was not only let free, but obliged to take gold, silver, and Pontic jewellery to deepen the sense of vice and debt hung upon his life. He agreed in order to leave quickly, and everyone got what they wanted from the meeting, both in the open and in secret. Let us return to this when Amadokus makes his next move. I have told you already about the many foreign delegates at this court who made concessions to the Basileus tis Polis, and now I will detail the most important case of this. One of the diplomats was a man named Aemilianus, whose full name was long and pompous, as is the style of his people, the Romans. The fortune of the Romans in this time is covered extensively elsewhere. In fact, I have written plenty on the matter myself. We need only place ourselves in the right moment to begin describing how their world collided with that of the Bosporans, and indeed of the Scions of Gold. This name became popular very quickly, even before the foundation of the organization that made it famous all over the world, which I shall bring to us too in due time. It was the time when the ruling council of nobles, called the Senate, was made to elect a dictator for several years in succession, due to the invasions of the Gallic people into the Attali Peninsula, which caused great damage to Roman vassal cities and defeated several armies under once respected generals. It was from this need for military minds and firm rule that the Julius clan arose, tracing their lineage back for hundreds of years to the Julii tribe of ancient times, who were among the first to establish themselves on the lands near Rome after they rose from the sea. Two brothers of this clan, Gaius and Sextus, had both held a high office called a consulship, similar in power to an archon, at a young age, and were famous as politicians and military men by the time they were 20 years old. Their emissary, Aemilianus, was a man of their senate loyal to Gaius, who was dictator for the year 182 prior. I should explain here that the Romans had a self-imposed aversion to kings, because it was a place where rich men took up politics as a pastime, and therefore they needed a state of chaos to reign in higher offices to provide them their sport, which in turn made the state wealthy and dynamic, if prone to the utmost corruption you can possibly imagine. Since the practicalities of ruling an empire still required that kings be used, they would elect men to act as king for a short time, and they called them dictator instead. While many Greek cities also did this, the Romans claimed to have invented the idea. They cannot be truly accredited with it, though they can be fully lauded for the way in which they brought the idea to its deathbed. Although perhaps that credit lies squarely with Gaius Julius Caesar, of whom Aemilianus spoke warmly and piously before the balancing blade of Pairisades. From the treaty that was ultimately made, we can surmise that Aemilianus, like many Romans, was familiar with various particulars of the Lithosis religion spreading on the steppe, either because they had been informed of it by merchants, or perhaps warned of it by Pairisades' enemies. Aemilianus likened his master Gaius to the kings of the Golden Age, I believe, and wanted to bring both Gaius and Pairisades into alliance in the hopes of amplifying the power of the Roman Republic. By this point, Rome had colonies across the western Mediterranean, and was called the Pilot of Africa by terrified Greeks on the southern coast. The notion of alliance was present in this first treaty by way of an agreed meeting of houses, in which Pairisades would ingratiate his family with that of Gaius. It is a sign of the interest Rome expressed that the meeting was arranged to take place in Apollon, yet this was also done to reflect the ability of Rome to send its most important men to far-off places without considering it an inconvenience or danger. Pairisades summoned his family from Coriscos for this meeting. It may even surprise you to learn that he had a family, given his adventurous nature. He had not ignored his duties to the dynasty, and left his wife bearing children at each chance he got. She bore 6 children over the years, always in his absence, and it is said that Pairisades was more like an acquaintance than a true father to his family. Alas, one cannot achieve much in one realm of life without being negligent in others, and this was, I say, the most enormous difference between Pairisades and his brother, who was better able to balance his achievements between important spheres. Not that we should wish Pairisades had acted differently, for countless other families could only flourish because he had overlooked his own, which is something that the gods wished kings be forced to recall in the modern age. I say this because of his 4 sons and 2 daughters, only 2 sons and 1 daughter survived their early life, and it was specifically the latter 3 born who were sickly, and the earlier 3 who were whole. The 3 who lost their lives were those conceived after the time when Pairisades went to the deep woods, and hence we see the connection between the loss of these children and the ill fate that befell the Spartakids at Tanais, the disappearance of 3 other princes and princesses. Each brother gave 3 children in exchange for their command over all those men below them. It takes only a cursory study of the ancient records to see that this is in accordance with the magic of the Golden Age, and even though that magic had not fully returned, the fact that penalties like that were applied to 2 important men shows that the wellspring of gold had nearly been breached. So that there be record of it, I shall tell you that the names of those children who were lost were Corina, Lycurgos and Lysander, in order of their birth, and it is with pleasure that I make their marks here, for these are very difficult to discover names due to the secrecy with which both their birth and demise was treated. The 3 elder children were completing their education around this time and preparing to serve the dynasty, and that is precisely what interested Aemilianus, who was released home to report his success and arrange the planned conference at Apollon. Doubtless he had originally come to the city to join a scheme against the Spartakids, but Roman ways were such that victory trumped honor, and to gracefully switch sides was as easy as deciding to eat when one is hungry. And ever were the Romans hungry for pleasures and poisons alike. These were the main events of the days that followed the fall of Apollon. They were ultimately superseded in importance by the task of translating the Getae's vast collection of runestones, although simple interrogation of those court magicians who had done so prior helped hold fast the composure of those hungering for truth. We know that the Getae did not have a proper translation, and we know that pieces of the runestones were forgeries, and as before I will do you the service of bringing you only the vital information that was confirmed to be true in the decades to come. Although I shall admit that most of this work was done by scholars who are no longer around today to be assessed for their strength of mind or character. Such was the price of knowledge in that time, and knowledge, we know, is at the core of the Getae mystery. First, I shall tell you something that is heartbreakingly true. Knowledge is unlike things of this world. It is more like a god, in the sense understood by the lithosis. That is to say, it can be produced and reproduced an infinite number of times. There is no limit to the people you can educate on a matter. And yet, amidst this infinite supply, there is never enough knowledge for everyone. It is, in fact, impossible to sate all hunger, even from a bowl that never depletes, or any number of such bowls, for that was the detestable curse that befell our world when Manos died and ignorance was born. Recall that Manos transformed himself into a man in order to maintain the magic of the world after the loss of his brother Yimo, first of the dead. He walked his lands, of which then there were few, and he saw the things that the world was made of. He saw earth, water, stone, air, the sun, the moon, the plants, the clouds, and the aether of the cosmos, mixing and awakening, the legacy of Taurus. And on these grounds were the men, who bore resemblance to Yimo in their form, and were enjoying the sleep before the beginning of history. Manos sensed that the strength of these men was too little, and that the light of Taurus would overwhelm the world with unintelligent things. The world had to balance light and dark, for that was the condition of all existent things passed down to it by the cosmos itself. For this Manos wept, for he had dreamt of a different world. And yet his tears were like springs that burst forth rivers and awakened the children of Yimo, of the dark, who could not open their eyes in the light. Manos saw that he still had some of his power, and he decided to create more humans to bridge the light and the dark, and balance mankind against the world. He made them now in his image. Hence from each of his tears on the ground now grew women, until there was a woman for every man, which gave mankind a way to grow endlessly. After achieving this, Manos found that he no longer was a god at all, his powers expended. That was when he became known as Manos the Sage, the first king, the one from whom all of this of which we speak came to be known. This knowledge, in that time, was bountiful and satisfying, and there was no one who did not know where the world was from, or the serene value of a life lived in perfect order. Man and world grew together, and those who laboured hardest in this endeavour were granted the rank of king, who would keep the order and ensure that all was to their liking. And when they died, their blood would become a cloud that rained down sweetly and showed his people new things and new places that his devotion to magic had created in the world. And so during this golden age, there came to be many fascinating places and creatures, and all of them were given a place and purpose by those kings who then rightly rose anew. Manos the Sage oversaw his people from a modest bench outside his home in Kuriksu, until one day someone came to see him and found that he was not there. Another came and found that he was there for all to see and hear. Further investigation revealed that now and again someone would be born who could not see Manos, and could not understand anything relayed from the sage to their ears. Over time, those cursed so became many, and this process seemed to be unalterable. This was the beginning of the end of the Golden Age, and it was this story that Lithosis and Getae both shared and attested to, knowing it was true. So why did the Getae become so lost? It was because of the purported reason for this curse coming to be, and their runes spoke somewhat of this, but that did not come to be well understood until after certain events took place in the present. So let us join the distraction of the Bosporans by reviewing these important things. We must turn our attention back to Amadokus, for he drove the next upheaval with a scheme that twisted the divinity of the Golden Age to serve his ailing masters, a cause to which noble powers cannot honestly pledge. Here is what he did. After being released in humiliation and feigning love for his own life, he went to find King Cosingus, brother of the late King Metakos of the Getae. This brother dwelt in the rich lands along the northern bank of the Istros, a passage between river and mountain that marks the edge of the developed world to most who write of it. I hope this account has convinced you already that this was an ill-assigned boundary. Amadokus begged Cosingus to surrender to the Bosporans, and said that he pledged on his honour and his life to bring such an end to the war, so he would accept nothing less than this while still drawing breath. Cosingus, new to rule and in awe of Amadokus, was willing to agree. He went to Apollon in a few weeks after its fall and accepted titles from Pairisades, along with another embarrassing set of valuables that demonstrated the greed of his people to all who saw it. Many farms and small towns were made subject again to Apollon, which was at the time the largest and most prosperous city in the empire. This state of affairs would comfortably set itself into the tablet of history, for the wealth the Getae had once enjoyed was now at the disposal of Pairisades. The prince had no plans to use it for anything other than rewarding his troops, being not at all civic-minded as a leader. However, others would come later who would make Getae gold into something of far greater worth, as I shall detail in time. The next stage of Amadokus' scheme was to ball up the humiliation he had endured and return it to the Spartakid estate as if it was an escaped slave. His love of his life was, in truth, not greater than his love for the people and his gods, and though he was misguided, his courage is hard to ignore. For next, he arranged his manor in such a way that it appeared to have been ransacked, which did not take long, for his home was modest and he was the sole resident. With the scene depicted to his liking, he slew himself without delay and fell among the detritus, his blood hardly pooling on his stone floor, for it was so desperate to make its way into the earth to find relief and reward. The ground quaked, and even Apollon itself suffered damage because of this. The danger of it brought concerned passers-by to call at Amadokus' house and ensure he was unharmed, thus coming to learn he was not a victim of the quake, but its progenitor. Thus died one who was blessed by the gods, killed by the only power permitted to do so, his own hand. As Amadokus had intended, the scene communicated treachery and foul play, and who else could be to blame but the jealous, vengeful and corrupt Pairisades? That was the story of the night, and there was nothing the Bosporans could say to douse it. Within days there was no place it could not be heard among the territories of King Casingus. All were beside themselves with sorrow and fury, and there was no peace or notion of peace. The Bosporans in Apollon withdrew to the citadel, and the army combined their encampments into a fort, with so many sentries posted that one would expect a bloody battle was imminent, and one, indeed, would be wise in that observation. Pairisades had to take great care to scout the region, knowing that his enemies were rising again somewhere close. Envoys rode west and east to delay the conference with the Republic, and it was not clear that Pairisades' family was safe, for they could have already been close to the Petrodava Pass at the time. Showing dedication he is not usually credited for, he summoned most of his riders to go survey the pass for them in person. We have no record of the specific event that took place there, because our usual source, Diotrephes, was left to command the city, as he had done so admirably after the establishment of Chariskos. He began to raise troops there from the foreigners and tribal allies who lived in the city, and was forever on guard, for the streets became unsafe to many kinds of people. He refers to this time in his notes as one of tension, and forgoes describing it in detail, both to ensure it did not tarnish the honour of his dynasty, and also because he was more concerned with wishing well to his prince and patriarch. One gets the impression that they had become very good friends. Yet the return of the prince would not be especially happy, for he came with fewer men than he left with, floating on the overspilled rage of the people for whom there was, I emphasize, simply not enough knowledge to save. The Bosporan party travelling from Chariskos had been accosted by Hermanian mercenaries carrying coins of Apollon. Many lives were exchanged to remedy this, and from the captives taken, Pairisades learned that a large army was assembling to restore King Casingus to power. Casingus, as a vassal of the empire, was summoned to Apollon, yet no reply came. There is no clearer sign of rebellion, for even outright declaring your rebellious intent could be seen as a jest. Silence is where the deepest darkness congeals. Pairisades turned his focus to finding where the Getae were massing their forces, and did so quickly due to the scale of the mobilization taking place. There was a large camp in the hills, only a few days' ride from the city, that could not easily be challenged, and was always well manned and prepared. Prince Pairisades also wished to muster his forces and send agents to locate Gwena Greek-speaker in the First Lands, so he decided to limit his retaliation to harassing their foragers and raiding the roads when fresh bands came to join the camp. And even this stopped when the response became too forceful. The Getae were now employing greater numbers of tall shields and long wings of light horsemen, understanding the causes of their prior defeats. So, since they were no longer easy to assail, they were left to build their position against the city for nearly an entire year. During this time, Gwena Greek-speaker was not yet found, for she was organizing many important things in the Deep Woods. The Greeks could not know this. There was some respite though, as she learned of the insecurity her chosen protege had encountered and was able to send over 1,000 additional riders to bolster Apollon. Many of them were steppe folk trained in the lithosis style, and that such people existed already is as clear a sign as there can be that the ways of the woods were seeping over the first lands. There were many tribes who took up lithosis customs and welcomed their warriors to provide expert instruction, and in exchange, the Bosporan Empire treated those tribes well, and I think the reason why this was so successful was that to these people it seemed like they were not submitting themselves entirely to one power or the other, creating the illusion that they were not dominated by an overlord, when in truth they had two. Eventually, at the close of summer in the year 181 prior, Pairisades had waited and delayed long enough. The Getae rebellion had seemingly achieved little by occupying and expanding their camp, but the prevention of intercourse with the West and the mood of upheaval their presence forced upon the lands was more than enough to have choked the Bosporan Empire amid its victorious gulp. Their position was strong, encamped on a forested hillside that diminished the effectiveness of cavalry raids. Pairisades brought his army to assemble on the open fields at the hill's foot, and while he had an idea of what to do, he put on a show of not knowing, until finally he dismounted and walked to his reserve company in the rear. There he begged counsel from a youth named Rebellious, and this youth was none other than his eldest son. Rebellious benefited from a military education, and supposedly was able to recognize the disadvantage in attacking the rebel position. Rebellious was not a military mind, I think it is safe to say in retrospect, so we cannot know how much of his father's guile is falsely attributed to the son. I mention this detail only so that you might know this was the first time Rebellious was exposed to open battle as a willing participant. More guiding moments on his rise to prominence will be detailed in time. If you believe the prince's own writings, it was Rebellious who discerned that the majority of the Getae horsemen were stationed on part of the hillside where the forest was sparse, since they had not the skill of the lithosis to wind and vault their way through thick woodland. This opening was like a bundle of reeds used to stop a jug, and the Bosporans went there to ply the strategy the steppe had taught to every creature it harboured. A show of an attack up the hill was put on, and when the mouths of the Getae were foaming with bloodlust, being above their targets and on faster horses, sinews were cut, and the right wing of the rebel army came down the hill, infantry led by horses, horses by hunters, and these hunters by the ambivalent spirit of pitiless Manos, which was not stirred by their prayers. Once away from the trees, the Getae saw how much of the Bosporan army was close by, or perhaps they did not see this in their mad charge. The clash of sides took place at the base of the hill, with the advantage of height robbed from the rebels keenly. Perhaps half of those charging had been wounded, killed, or seen their horses suffer one of these fates, so its impact was severely diminished. Then came a melee in full view of the rest of the Getae on the hillside, into which the remainder of the right wing was already proceeding. It would take troops of iron discipline and a commander of nerve and talent to avert disaster, and this was not what the Getae had. Like floodwater they came, the forest and heights losing their luster, the call of battle compelling beyond all hope of living another day. The Bosporans needed only to back away and let their foe deploy in the open, and at once the conditions under which the Getae had been massacred on previous occasions were again met. It was now a day of arrows, and Pairisades toured his companies, with Rebellious in tow, so that his son would see what victory looked like. Rebellious, some say, was not so much interested in the battle as in the rites that should be performed with those who fell, and this would be consistent with his upbringing in the royal compound at Chariskos, where studious analysis of lithosis magic was known to take place. Others note that the lad was seen marching into the fray on foot, with his guards similarly dismounted, and he fought against a Getae band with spear and shield, as princes did in ancient times. I believe that the father here was only attempting to further create a reputation for his son, in the full knowledge that the boy would not create such a reputation of his own accord. You might say this demonstrates the comfort with which Pairisades had come to view open battle, for victory was hardly a concern, only that he get the chance to act as a guiding parent to his child. I will note though that after this event, he did not try to do anything like this again, and I wonder if it was more of an experiment to see if such a role was to his own liking. I get the impression that is how Pairisades thought about these matters, broadly speaking, but I am sure more careful readers of history than me will be able to disagree. By any road, the Getae who were equipped in traditional style were eliminated without much effort. The horsemen were driven away by fierce fighting and force of numbers, and then those infantry who were better prepared could be driven around the field like mice searching for a gap in the wall, while the cat prowls contentedly. In this way, the rebellion was wiped clean over the course of the day, and the most rabid of the Getae men were never to disturb the peace again. The army returned to Apollon in victory, and enjoyed a festival of victory, serving to reward the people for their loyalty, and to make a loud chorus of the news that the Bosporans had won the land by all the ancient laws of war. It was declared that the loss of life incurred was more than enough to calm the realm of mankind, and that a period of peace should be expected for all peoples who had any knowledge of the fallen. And that appears to have been what happened. In fact, there was a time when it was not war, but celebration, building, and the spread of wisdom that occurred, with Apollon at the centre of it all, and with Pairisades at the centre of Apollon. His family took up residence in the citadel, although we know that Pairisades himself was forever marauding around the city, trying to glean any tidbits of the local culture he could from the cowed peoples, and also keeping his eyes on the eastern road, for he had much to discuss with Gwena Greek-speaker and her kin. Likewise, the western road trembled in anticipation of the arrival of Rome, the city that commanded military power above all others at the time, and whose great men were of equal interest to the chirping masses of their city and to the shamans of the Deepwood. Indeed, out of view of all his empire, beyond the Sarmatian mountains, Pairisades was laying the stones that would dam and pool the river of history at his own back. Yet, I am completely to blame for focusing entirely on his dramatic endeavours, while his own liege lord and elder brother was, a world away, engaged in the homely task of cultivating the First Lands. Or more precisely, he was dealing with its pests, and there were many battles that took place during these years we have covered in the east. So let us detour to learn how the First Lands were at last brought together under the brother kings, which will then take us to the time at which the matter of who was truly king would need to be addressed in no uncertain terms.